Welcome tonight to the 5th week of the Origin Science Scholars, sponsored by the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and IdeaStream, with the assistance of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Museum of Natural History, and the generous support of Richard Morrison. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Cynthia Beall, the S. Idel Pyle Professor of Anthropology, Professor of Anatomy, Professor of Global Health, and Distinguished University Professor here at Case Western Reserve University. Professor Beall's research focuses on human adaptation to high altitude hypoxia, particularly the different patterns of adaptation exhibited by Andean, Tibetan, and East African Highlanders. And for this work, she's been named to the National Academy of Sciences. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Beall for her talk, Natural Selection and Adaptation.
Welcome to campus. I'm talking about natural selection and adaptation. And this follows very naturally, so to speak, on Darren Croft's talk last week. Natural selection is a process whereby individuals with a better chance of reproducing leave more offspring. That, in a nutshell, is it. And adaptations are the outcome of this process, and an adaptation is a characteristic that gives or confers this better chance of surviving and reproducing. So we can look at this finch. You already know that finches are famous for their beaks, so we can ask questions about their beaks. And what is it about the beak of the finch, this finch, that gives it a better chance of surviving and leaving more offspring? This is a naked mole rat. And you look at that and you think, yes, what is it about that gives it a better chance of surviving and reproducing? This is a cane toad. Cane toads also are subject to natural selection and adaptation. This is a family. This woman and her children also exemplify natural selection, the outcome of natural selection and adaptation. Key to this process of natural selection is biological variation. That is the raw material for natural selection. And virtually any biological characteristic that we might look at varies. Now, to illustrate that, I'd like to ask everyone to give me a thumbs up. Okay, now take a look at your thumbs. Now, do your thumbs look like mine? They don't. Do they okay? Some people said yes and some people said no, right? I have what's called a hitchhiker's thumb. My thumb points back like this. This is an autosomal recessive trait. Many of you have straight thumbs. Well, you are either heterozygous, that is, you have one trait allele for this kind of thumb and one for a straight thumb, or you have two for the straight thumb. So there you go. We've got an illustration of biological variation, and I have no idea why we have that particular variant. What I plan to do is to illustrate the central concepts of natural selection and adaptation. Where does the on button? Okay. I will be illustrating the central concepts of natural selection and adaptation. Finch beaks illustrate morphological evolution and adaptation. Sickle cell anemia illustrates molecular evolution and adaptation. And the outcomes of natural selection are biological change through time and biological diversity, as illustrated by this classic drawing of Darwin's finches from Galapagos Island. So let's start with the finches on Galapagos Islands as an illustration of morphological evolution. This is one of the Galapagos. It's called Daphne major. And two evolutionary biologists, Rosemary and Peter Grant, have been working there on this little tiny island since the early 70s. The island is about 600 yards in one direction, 600 yards in the other direction. And they're still married, and they return every year, and they capture and measure and census every bird on the island. It's vital to have this kind of information, and it is vital to collect this kind of data in order to study evolution by natural selection and its outcomes. This is the study subject, the species, the medium ground finch, number 2 up here, that they have written a lot about and that we know a lot about, evolutionary changes. This is another ground finch, and this is one that is here, this cactus eater, and this one eats seeds. So you can see in living birds today a parallel to the differences in finch beaks that Darwin saw and his collaborators saw. Variation. We need to consider it. Finch beak shape varies. So when the Grants measure the medium ground finch and they measure the width of the beak, they get a nice normal curve like this. They also found, because they go every year and they know which birds are the parents and which are the offspring, they know that parents with large beaks had offspring with large beaks up here. They know that parents with small beaks had offspring with small beaks. And they could actually quantify the degree to which the variation in beak size was heritable. And this is a measure called heritability. Heritability refers to what proportion of all the variation among individuals is due to their biological relationships, that is, due to genetic differences among them. And about 74% of the heritability about 74% of the variation was heritable. That's a very high proportion. That means that a lot of the variation that we see is heritable, and the higher the heritability, the stronger the potential response to natural selection. In the 70s, there was a drought on Daphne Major. And this was very severe. Hardly any rain fell, hardly any plants grew, hardly any seeds were produced. Only about 15% of the finches on Daphne Major survived the drought. And it wasn't just any random selection of 15%. It was the finches with the larger beaks who survived the drought. Why did they survive the drought? They did so because they had the larger beaks, and as the smaller seeds were depleted, they could also, with their larger and stronger beaks, crack the larger seeds. So they had a wider range of food that they could eat, and they plain old survived. And in the next generation, illustrated here, the average beak size had shifted to the right, had shifted towards larger beaks. This line shows the previous mean, and this current peak shows the present peak after selection. This small blue triangle represents the area where there was particularly high mortality. This is an example of what we call directional selection. That is, natural selection acted to move the mean in one direction. And the means whereby this took place was differential survival. That is, the birds with the beaks with the larger, did I say that right? The birds with the larger beaks had greater survival, left more offspring, and in the next generation, the average beak size was larger. Now, since then, we've learned more about the beaks of the finches on Darwin's Islands, and we can get some more refined knowledge and understanding of what's going on. The birds with the larger beaks also had higher infant mortality. So whereas you might think, boy, next time there's a drought, beak size will get even larger. Next time there's a drought, it'll get even larger. And in fact, that's hypothetically possible, but in practice, it turns out that at the same time that there was selection against the small beaks, there was selection against birds with very large beaks because they're baby birds, not infants. The baby birds had a lower survival rate. So following the directional selection, there was what we call stabilizing selection. So we get a closer distribution around that mean in the subsequent generation. We've got selection against the smaller beaks, selection against the very bigger beaks for different reasons. One, the smaller beaked individuals were less able to crack the large seeds. Two, the very large beaked individuals had fewer offspring. So we had two forms of natural selection illustrated over time in this one population of ground finches. We knew that the ground finch beak size was heritable. A few years ago, a couple of geneticists determined independently what the genes were that are involved in regulating beak length, beak width, and beak depth. And it turns out that one gene influences length and width, and another gene influences depth. And the way they influence beak size is by the time during bird development that these genes turn on and start making the protein that leads to beak growth. So the earlier the genes turn on, the longer or the wider or the deeper the beak. And in fact, there are 14 different species of Darwin's finches, all with variants of beak size and shape, and we can account for all 14 variants by simple differences in timing of the expression of these genes. So it's big morphological change from the small pointy beak to this big beak, but the actual mechanism is very modest. So major morphological change, minor genetic change. Let's take a second example of natural selection and adaptation, and that is sickle cell anemia in the Old World. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, she's talking about a disease. She's talking about a disease where if you inherit 2 copies of one gene for the sickle cell trait, then you have a disease called sickle cell anemia, and you have a very low survival rate. So why didn't evolution get rid of that? She must be confused. Well, I'm often confused, but this is a bona fide example. And then here's how the development of understanding began. And that is in the 1940s and 50s, scientists, epidemiologists, geneticists realized that in sub-Saharan Africa, there were 2 deadly blood diseases with very similar geographic distribution. This is the distribution of a form of malaria called falciparum at that time. And you can see that it was distributed throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Here, a little band around the Mediterranean, through the Mideast and into India. Then we can look at the frequency of the gene that if you inherit 1 copy, you have the hemoglobin sickle cell trait. If you have 2 copies, you have sickle cell anemia. The darker the color, the higher the frequency of that gene. And notice how those patterns overlap. we can see that the hemoglobin S allele is distributed in sub-Saharan Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and India. So a very early hypothesis then from the 1940s is that somehow hemoglobin S, the form of hemoglobin that one has if one inherits an abnormal hemoglobin, protects against falciparum malaria. Now, falciparum malaria and what's called a balanced polymorphism. A balanced polymorphism occurs when we have two forms of alternate forms of a gene that are maintained in the population by natural selection. Now, falciparum malaria, we know, we're all familiar with as a public health problem, right? We know malaria kills more than 1 million children every year. 15% of the people alive suffer from malaria. More than 2 billion people are threatened with malaria because they live in a malarious zone. So we know it as an enormous public health issue. It also is a very important natural selection, evolution, and adaptation issue. If we consider malaria from the standpoint of evolution by natural selection, we ask the question, okay, we know there's variation in hemoglobins. Is everyone equally who is exposed to malaria equally likely to get sick? The answer is no. Is everyone exposed equally likely to die? No. Falciparum malaria has acted and continues to act as an agent of natural selection in human populations. And another important factor to keep in mind is that our own activities are largely responsible for this situation. We have created the environmental conditions that allow malaria to flourish. So whereas the birds on Daphne Major did not change their environment, they had nothing to do with the drought. In our case, in the case of falciparum malaria, we have a lot to do with it. First of all, we need to consider the variation. Hemoglobins A and S are variants of one gene that produces one of the proteins that make up our hemoglobin, which carries oxygen. So here is a snapshot, if you will, of a little tiny section of normal hemoglobin, and this is a DNA base, thymine. It binds with adenine. When thymine codes for amino acids in this chain in our hemoglobin, it codes for glutamate. If the T and the A by mutation flip, as they have down here, so now we have A on this strand instead of T on this strand. That codes for a different amino acid. That one amino acid change out of the 3 billion causes people, if they inherit 2 copies of this, to have sickle cell anemia. So there are 3 possible genotypes or variants at this locus with these 2 alleles. You could have 2 copies of normal hemoglobin, and I'll abbreviate that hemoglobin AA. You could have 2 copies of hemoglobin S, the variant for sickle cell anemia, and you would have sickle cell anemia. Or you could have one of each, and you have sickle cell trait. This year, 2010, marks the 100th anniversary of the first publication, the first description of sickle cell anemia. And these are the figures published in 1910 by a Chicago physician who was describing someone who walked into the clinic who had chronic anemia. And you can see how it got the name, sickle cell. These are normal-shaped red blood cells. They're little concave discs. And here are some that are in funny shapes. sickled. The three genotypes have different chances of surviving and reproducing in an environment where there is falciparum malaria. So here we've got the A, the AS, and the SS. And what we know now from direct experiment and from epidemiological information is that in an area where there's falciparum malaria, that there's a high chance of someone who has hemoglobin AA contracting malaria and dying from it. In contrast, there's a low chance for the other two variants to contract malaria and die from it. They'll contract malaria, they get mild cases. They don't have very many plasmodia. So they're not too likely to die from it. And we know this actually from some very wonderful, terrible in retrospect, but at the time, this was tested directly by infecting volunteers. And at the time this was done, it was easy to cure falciparum malaria. So they were, they found that people with AA, whom they infected, got malaria, and the AS individuals did not. They did not test any low SS individuals because there were no adults in their community who were hemoglobin SS homozygotes. And that is because of mortality due to sickle cell anemia. Without medical care, there's a very high pre-reproductive mortality rate. The average age of death is probably under 20 without good medical care for these individuals. However, the AS individuals, those variants, were not dying from sickle cell anemia. They do not have that problem. And of course, the AA individuals didn't. So we can talk about the fitness, that is the likelihood of surviving and reproducing in an environment, and its fitness specific to this environment. So in an environment with falciparum malaria, the fitness of the A individuals is low. The fitness of S individuals is low regardless of whether there is falciparum malaria. And the highest fitness, the people with the highest chance, the variants with the highest chance of survival and reproduction, are the heterozygotes. And we call this a heterozygote advantage. So by common consent, we give them a fitness of 1. Of course, they don't all survive to adulthood. Some get were hit by buses or die of malaria anyway, but relatively speaking, they have the highest survival rate. The people with hemoglobin SS, 0 is an extreme value to give them because some people would make it to reproductive age, but very few. The relative fitness of the AA homozygotes is 0.66. So that means that, let's say, for every 100 AS individuals who survive to adulthood, only 66 A individuals do. Now, what the heterozygote advantage does is it results in maintaining both alleles in the population. So this is evolution by natural selection. It produces some people in the population who are well adapted. This is not perfect. As people who are born with hemoglobin SS will tell you, that is a high cost. But it is better than the alternative. It is better than everyone being hemoglobin AA. We understand some of the mechanisms whereby the AS heterozygotes have higher survival rates, although by no means all. And it has to do with the fact that the red blood cells circulate, they carry oxygen, we know that. The hemoglobin carries oxygen. And the hemoglobin gives up its oxygen when it's out in the tiny capillaries. People who have only hemoglobin S have red blood cells that when they give up their oxygen, they move to the periphery, the margins of the blood vessels. And they start moving slower. And as they give up their oxygen, they assume this sickle shape. And then some of them, and the sickle shape changes the shape of the red blood cell, and it also changes the ability of the red blood cell to squish through the tiny capillary. So here's a normally shaped red blood cell going through a tiny capillary, and it's squishing. Think of your red blood cell as a little baggie full of hemoglobin. And the baggie full of hemoglobin is deformable, and so that's your normal hemoglobin. But once it's full of sickled hemoglobin, it gets stuck. So the plasmodia are in our red blood cells. The plasmodia are using up some of our oxygen. They're causing more of the oxygen to be used. They're causing more of the hemoglobin to give up the oxygen, and they're causing more of this sickling. The sickled red blood cells burst. They release plasmodia, and the plasmodia get eaten, so to speak. They get taken care of by the immune system. If the sickled red blood cell containing the plasmodium makes it through the circulation, makes it back to the spleen, then the spleen may remove the red blood cells. So this is one of the ways in which the plasmodia are decreased in numbers by having hemoglobin S. This balanced polymorphism also illustrates molecular evolution and coevolution of 3 species. We need a plasmodia. These are red blood cells infected with plasmodia, which you can't see. But I couldn't find any copyright-free pictures of plasmodia. So imagine plasmodia in those red blood cells. That is the infectious agent, one organism. The second organism, a female of the Anopheles species of Anopheles gambii. Only the female takes blood meals. You can see she's looking like she's had a nice one. And she is going to suck up plasmodia from a host, let's say this woman and a little kid who is not in its bed net, and then it can fly to another person, bite them, and inject the plasmodia in the other person. So in order to maintain chronic infection, and in many places of the world, where that map showed, almost everyone has malaria throughout his life. In order to maintain that, we have to have this vector to take the plasmodia from host to host. The Anopheles mosquito has adapted to its immune system has adapted so that it doesn't get sick from carrying the plasmodia. We've got these 3 species. Why do we have these 3 species together in numbers high enough to maintain a situation where almost everyone has malaria all the time? It's because of us and agriculture. Beginning about 2,000 years ago, a new form of agriculture was introduced into sub-Saharan Africa. It's called slash and burn. And this is a picture of slash and burn agriculture. It is literally that. You go in and you whack down the vegetation, you burn it off, you leave the stumps and so forth, and start planting. And that was great because it allowed us to plant, to harvest, to plan. It allowed us people to settle down, and they grew more food, they grew more people, and this form of agriculture also results in more habitat for mosquitoes. So more people, more mosquitoes, more sick people, more plasmodia. Yes! Population increasing. And so it was probably at this time that selection began to favor the hemoglobin AS or the hemoglobin S mutation. Now, I'm talking thousands of years, right? I'm talking many generations. Generations for the drought, generations for 2,000 years. Now, we've got a couple of key things. We've got environment change, we've got variation that are key elements to evolution by natural selection and adaptation. Now, you may be thinking, well, this is nice. However, the environment could change, and I might not have 2,000 years to sit around and wait. Well, this is true. So there is more than one mode of adaptation. We've been talking about natural selection. It takes millennia, generations. Sometimes we don't have that long, or sometimes we don't need that long. There's something called developmental plasticity. That is, in some cases, not in all cases, but some environmental stresses can elicit a developmental adaptation so that if you grow up or you're exposed during a certain critical time of your life to that stress, you can adapt. That is, you can develop different characteristics. Now, you need to have the genes in order to develop those characteristics. So variation is still important, but in this case, selection has acted in the past, and you have inherited something that enables you to respond during your lifetime. Another mode of adaptation is called acclimatization. And this is something that is completely reversible and can take place in seconds, hours, or days. So you go out in the sun, and you don't wear your sunscreen, and you suntan. That's acclimatization. You sweat when you work out. That's acclimatization. Now, how much you suntan, whether you suntan or not, that is something that is variable, and it's variable depending upon your genetics. Now, you can avoid having to do any of these if you can mount a behavioral adaptation. If you can build a fire when it's cold, you don't have to get goosebumps and shiver. Some environments are environments to which we can adapt behaviorally, and some aren't. So if you think of the environment and you think of these various modes of adaptation, behavior is potentially very fast. Acclimatization also kind of up through days, maybe weeks. Developmental plasticity is going to take years. These others, generations and millennia. So we have a number of ways in which, modes in which we can adapt. So one of the points then, now that I'd like to turn to, is to look at these different modes and demonstrate that these are modes that have been selected for, that these also are adaptations that are the outcome of evolution by natural selection. First, to review a couple of examples, some very common examples, because I've given you two classic examples, and you might be thinking, how can I go about finding new examples? Well, there are a couple of ways. One is you can start with an obvious case of biological variation, and you can say, well, okay, how might that be accounted for by a natural selection? And skin color is something that has fascinated people, ever since the voyages of discovery, when Europeans and non-Europeans started seeing each other. They started noticing what different colors they had. And you can see some nice examples here in this picture of this basketball team. Variation in skin color is heritable. It's influenced by a number of different genetic loci. We also notice that variation is patterned by latitude. This guy's ancestors for sure came from the low latitudes. This guy's ancestors for sure came from the high latitudes. And we now know, as a result of accumulating knowledge, really since the 30s, that at high latitudes, at the latitudes like the British Isles, like Northern Europe, natural selection has resulted in depigmented skin, very little melanin. It's the amount and the number of melanin granules that we have in our skin that is a factor that determines how much, how dark our skin is. Being depigmented in the northern latitudes enables production of vitamin D. We Until recently, whenever I ask in class, I say, where do you get vitamin D? They say milk and orange juice. That's because they're supplemented nowadays. Our diets contain very little vitamin D, unless we lived we were like Eskimos and got a lot of oily fish. So we've been relying on vitamin D synthesis in our skin. It requires ultraviolet radiation. In the northern latitudes, there is very little ultraviolet radiation. On a seasonal basis, there isn't even any effective ultraviolet radiation. Right now, here in Cleveland, in the middle of October, we're probably in vitamin D winter. We love it, like today, when the sun is gorgeous and beautiful and sunny, but we're probably not making any vitamin D. So we need to make vitamin D during the short time period when there's enough UV radiation for us to do so. We need to be depigmented. At low latitudes, we had selection for the opposite. We had selection for heavily pigmented skin because there's lots of lots of ultraviolet radiation throughout the year. And there, in the low latitudes, because there's a lot of ultraviolet radiation and it's constant, we need to be protected against something called photodegradation. That is the same UV radiation and other wavelengths that penetrate our skin that help us make vitamin D also can penetrate into our bloodstream and literally degrade some of the nutrients, like folates. Folate is crucial for cell division. It's crucial for DNA replication. We need to be protected against that. So we have been able to develop hypotheses about variation in skin color and how it is the outcome, represents adaptive evolution by natural selection on the part of, and the environmental factor is UV radiation. Another way that we can look for evolution and natural selection is to say, well, let's find a stressful environment. And let's see what happens when we look at people or organisms that live in that stressful environment. Do we see any biological characteristics that appear adaptive? And then can we make our case? So here's an example of high altitude. This is the amount of oxygen we have here in Cleveland. Let's call it 100%. As we go up in altitude, let's say we go to Pikes Peak at 4,400 meters. That's about 14,000 feet. Well, at that altitude, every time you take a breath of air, you're only getting about 60% of the oxygen molecules that you get right here at sea level. That's a major stress. We have to be providing every cell in our body with oxygen on a regular basis so that it can make the energy to keep us alive. So this is a really severe stress. Every lungful of air doesn't have very much oxygen in it. It's unavoidable. You can't put on a sweater and avoid hypoxia. It's just you and your lungs and the rest of your system. And all residents are exposed to that same stress from birth, from conception to death. Conception to resurrection, I guess. You're exposed to hypoxia. This makes it a great stress, and it's really stressful and you can't get... So I've been working on how Tibetans adapt to this severe stress. One of the things that Tibetans have is the percent of their oxygen, of their hemoglobin that's carrying oxygen is very low. Here at sea level, 98% of our hemoglobin is carrying oxygen when it leaves the lungs. In Tibet, everyone has very low oxygen saturation, and some people have really low. So here's a little pedigree. This man who has an oxygen saturation, 90% of his hemoglobin is carrying oxygen. He marries a woman who only has 80% of her hemoglobin carrying oxygen. Now, if you went into your physician here at Cleveland and you had either one of these, your physician would say, I think we should perhaps investigate this. But these are healthy people in Tibet. So they have a homozygous offspring who marry a daughter who marries a heterozygous homozygous man, and they have a homozygous for the low oxygen saturation daughter. So we know there's variation despite the fact that they're at the same altitude, there are differences in how much oxygen their hemoglobin is carrying. And so we've got evidence then for this autosomal dominant allele B that results in 10% higher saturation. We don't know the genetic locus, but we've got a lot of pedigrees, thousands of them, that look like this. So we've got a potential for natural selection because natural selection requires heritable variation. Is there any evidence for it? Yes. Women who are estimated to have genotypes for the high oxygen saturation, these two genotype women, the heterozygote and the homozygote for 90% as compared to the homozygote for 80%, have more living children. If we look at the number of pregnancies, there's not that much variation, around 4.6, 4.8. If we look at the number of living children, the women with a low oxygen saturation genotype have fewer than half as many surviving children. It's mainly due to infant deaths. So it's very strong evidence for differential reproduction. And the fitness of the low saturation genotype was 43. So for every 100 children left behind by the high saturation women, only 43 were being left behind by the low saturation women. More examples of natural selection. You're going to think I'm a speciesist because I talk a lot about people, which is true, but just to give you an example. This is the cane toad. Cane toads were introduced into Australia in the 1930s to control insects on the cane crop. Well, they are the classic invasive species. They are toxic to snakes and birds, and they move really fast across the Australian landscape. Now, interestingly, because they're toxic, the numbers of a number of indigenous snakes and birds have declined since the introduction of the Australian cane toad. One of them, however, has evolved. And this is the red-bellied black snake. It now avoids toads, and that is heritable. And it's become partly resistant to their toxins, and that also is heritable. So we've had evolution by a predator. There's also been selection on the toad for moving fast, that is, colonizing faster and faster. So these things weigh, it looks kind of cute here, but it weighs 3 pounds. You can pick it up, and it's a toad. There's a cost to the toads. They're becoming arthritic. Those long legs and all that hopping, and their skeletons can't quite take it. Natural selection is ongoing in Framingham, Massachusetts. This is the church, Framingham. A longitudinal study took place starting in 1948. And this measured, I think it was something like 5,000 people in Framingham starting in 1948. And they've been measuring the people every 2 years since then. A sub-study has been son of Framingham, another 5,000 people, and grandson of Framingham, another 5,000 people. So it's been possible over the years to measure heritability of the traits. This was focusing on cardiovascular risk disease. So it's been possible to look at various traits and the fitness of individuals. And it turns out that total cholesterol levels, which we're familiar with as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, are heritable in Framingham. That is, about 61% of the variation among individuals is due to their genetic differences. And in fact, over the course of the 60 years of the study, the average cholesterol decreased by a few percent. And when we look at women's fertility, we see that women who had low total cholesterol had more surviving children than women who had high cholesterol. Now, 150 is well within the normal range. 300 is in the pathological range. But there was a difference in fitness. So natural selection, far from being something that occurs far away from us, it's occurring among us all around the world. right now. Approximately 15% of the couples in the world are infertile. So real potential there for natural selection. So that was the genetic mode. Let's move on to the developmental mode of natural selection and sex determination in alligators. The American alligator, you'll be interested to learn, develops as a male or a female depending upon the temperature at which it incubates. So there's a range of temperatures across which incubation is successful, and the high and the low temperatures are highly likely, not 100%, but highly likely to produce females. The middle temperature is highly likely to produce males. So what's going on? Well, some tests have been carried out, in the way of saying, well, is this an adaptation? Yeah, there are genes, there's heritable variation that determines the degree of vulnerability to temperature variation. And it also turns out that males that are born as a result of incubating at the middle temperatures, in fact, sire more offspring. So there is something about the males that develop at the appropriate temperature that is leading them to be more reproductively successful. So that's ongoing work. Another example, but that's an example of developmental adaptation. It's an exposure to the temperature during incubation only. Andean highlanders, another part of the world where people live at high altitude. If they're exposed to high altitude before puberty, they grow up to have very large lungs. This is another example of developmental acclimatization. So this, as long as he stays there, or she stays there, she'll grow up to have large lungs. And by large lungs, I mean about 25% larger than ours. They have very large lungs. Acclimatization. Acclimatization is reversible. Oh, wait, let me go back. Sorry, I forgot to tell you, what's the evidence that this is heritable? Because you need to have that piece of evidence in order to accept that this might have an adaptive basis, that it might be the outcome of evolution by natural selection. We can compare Andean highlanders with Europeans who are born and raised at high altitude. Now, Europeans born and raised at high altitude have not lived there and been subject to evolution by natural selection for 10,000 years the way Andean highlanders have. Europeans that are born and raised at altitude also have larger lungs than us here at sea level. So they're capable of developmental adaptation, but not as much. So the Andean highlanders have been selected to have a larger developmental adaptation, a more marked developmental adaptation. And the heritability is good for that, for the lung size. Okay, on to acclimatization. Acclimatization is reversible, and it can take place in minutes or in days, or maybe a few days. Now, I talked about variation in skin color, and I talked about people at low latitudes and people at high latitudes, darkly pigmented, quite depigmented. And what about people in the middle latitudes? Well, people in the middle latitudes are exposed seasonally to high levels of ultraviolet radiation, and they have another option. They have tanning. And people do vary in the degree and the extent to which they tan. And that there is a genetic basis to tanning. When people like us, I'm assuming all of us are from low altitude, visit, this is Everest Base Camp at 5,400 meters, and we go trekking, and we go to high altitude, and we increase the amount of hemoglobin that we make. I already said that when we go to high altitude, the percent of our hemoglobin that carries oxygen falls. Well, that occurs immediately. That's as soon as you step off the plane. However, over the course of a few weeks, you make more hemoglobin, and you've got a bigger sponge. There's less oxygen, but you've got a bigger sponge. So this is viewed as adaptive. This occurs while we're at altitude. When we come back down to sea level, gradually those extra red blood cells die and we return. So both of these are examples of acclimatization. They can be achieved throughout the life cycle, and they're reversible. What about behavior? Can behaviors be adaptations? Well, yeah, they can. Can evolution by natural selection result in behaviors that are going to favor certain sets of behaviors and that we can measure in the form of reproductive success? And one example comes from baboons. A lot of baboons live in large groups. They're very social. They spend a lot of time grooming one another. And here we got a couple, I just almost said people, a couple of baboons grooming each other. And but there's variation among individuals in how much grooming they do and who they groom. And we can measure, how much grooming, the number of individuals grooming, and we can construct a sociality index. And we can do this particularly for we can do it for males and females, but we're going to look at female reproductive success. And we can compare, let's say, 4 levels of sociality in baboon females. And we see that the higher the sociality, the more social, the more grooming they do, the more offspring they have. Interesting. So yeah, there's potential there. What about us? Of course, our behavior is all learned, right? No. There's a hormone called oxytocin that mediates trust, it mediates bonding with mates, and it mediates bonding with offspring, mother love. And oxytocin is a protein. It's coded for by genes. There are variants of the oxytocin protein. There are variants of the oxytocin receptor. We know that we can manipulate our trust. We can manipulate the trust of humans by giving them nose spray of oxytocin. No kidding. And so there's real potential here for evolution of our behavior. The amount of oxytocin that we have in our receptors differ from those of other species. So trust, social behavior in us is influenced by, can easily be described as behavioral adaptations. Now, one thing that is happening that is really thrilling with respect to studying evolution by natural selection and is advances in genomics. All along we've had good evidence that certain things look like adaptations. But in order for it to be an adaptation, it has to be a heritable variant. It has to be something that improves on survival or reproduction. And we've developed over the years many techniques for determining whether or not variants are heritable. Advances in genomics have increased exponentially the speed with which we're making those kinds of discoveries. And up here I have an example of a Manhattan plot. And it's called a Manhattan plot because it illustrates it has a lot of dots down here. These are the low buildings in Manhattan in various chromosomes. This is a human Manhattan plot, 23. Actually, we don't have the X and Y, 22 chromosomes. And we're looking for unusually extreme variance in this Manhattan plot. And it's called a Manhattan plot because we've got a few things that stick up here that look like skyscrapers. Well, this is my skyscraper, EPAS 1. This turns out to be another key variant that we discovered, a very unusual variant present at unusually high frequencies in Tibetans that enables them to adapt to high altitude hypoxia. So there are going to be a lot of studies like this in the future. So to summarize, natural selection and adaptation are ongoing. Variation exists. It's heritable. Variation influences survival and reproduction. The outcome is organisms that are well adapted to their environments. Not perfectly, but well. Better than the alternative. We also have to take into account, to be realistic, that environmental change is a given. And it has unpredictable consequences. Evolution and adaptation are going to continue. Natural selection will be with us. And we must continue to test these hypotheses. Otherwise, we're not going to move forward in our understanding. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer questions.